So we're going to get going. Remember 2 weeks ago we talked about the name Elohim and kind of how the various spiritual beings we can that we see in the Bible, and we're going to continue on this topic, talking about spiritual beings, and then kind of work our way back to the character and the nature of God as the ultimate or the supreme Elohim. And we talk about all these spiritual beings. It's important to remember that they are created by Yahweh, and he'll talk about that in the video too. We're going to first look at this idea in Scripture. Sometimes it's called, you'll see it referred to as the divine council, the sons of God, and it's referring to, it's not necessarily meaning that they biologically were, or that they were birthed by God, but that they hold kind of a lower position. Kind of, there's a lot of places in Scripture, there's a scripture where they refer to in the Kings, during the time of Elijah and Elisha, they would talk about these people that were like the sons of the prophets. And it didn't mean that they were like the children of prophets, but it was more like they were almost like in an apprenticeship type thing, or they were a lower status within the prophetic community or something like that. They weren't quite on the level of a prophet of Isaiah or Elijah. So that's kind of when, or sometimes they'll even refer to it as like the heavenly court. We'll see words like that get thrown around. But let's go ahead. We're going to talk about the divine council, or look at the video on the divine council, and then we will talk about the council. This gets into the rebellion of the council, which we'll actually deal with more in a few weeks when we get into the Satan and demons in more detail. Let's go ahead and watch this.
For most of human history, people have believed in some kind of spiritual realm that exists alongside the world as we know it.
Right.
Oh, wait here.
Are no exception.
Yeah, for them, the spiritual realm is a different kind of...
Got one important thing.
That's much better than the way we had it down at Tim Place, ain't it?
Yeah. I forgot something though. Let me remember this. And then we'll start it. Support people who I'm recording this for, we're not able to see it or even hear it well. So,
Well, you can record off the YouTube.
off of Zoom. Okay? All right. Well, anyway, now we're going to go ahead and watch the video about the divine council.
For most of human history, people have believed in some kind of spiritual realm that exists alongside the world as we know it.
Right, and the biblical authors are no exception.
Yeah, for them, the spiritual realm is a different kind of realm than ours. And to highlight that difference, the Bible refers to God's space as the sky, or the heavens.
Because the sky is really different from the land. It's above and beyond. And up there are shiny bodies that move around. I think of these as flaming gas balls.
But when the biblical authors looked up, the stars gave them a way to talk and think about spiritual beings. In the Bible, they're called the sons of God, or the rulers and authorities, or even sometimes the divine council.
So that sounds really important. What does the divine council do?
Well, they're introduced in Genesis chapter 1, where they're called the host of heaven, that is, the sun, moon, and stars. And there, they're also called signs, meaning that their power and status symbolizes and points to God's power and status.
Yeah, so in Genesis 1, God appoints them to rule over the day and night.
Exactly. And then later in the Bible, we're told that they were celebrating God's power and creativity when he created the world.
Like the cheering section of a game.
Yeah, right. There are also stories in the Bible where God invites the divine council to participate in making a decision. Like when they help decide how to bring down the corrupt Israelite King Ahab. Or in the book of Job, where they debate God's policy of rewarding people who do good.
So they're like God's staff team. But why does God need a team? If he's powerful enough to create the whole universe, he could surely rule it without any help.
Well, he doesn't need them. But apparently, the God of the Bible wants to share authority with others.
Oh, right. God shares his rule with human partners on Earth. And so, in the same way, there's a parallel story of God sharing his authority to rule with spiritual partners.
Yes, that is, until it all falls apart in a twin rebellion. So you have humans who want to rule on Earth on their own terms. So they start building their own nation using their own definitions of good and evil.
Yeah, the famous story of the building of Babylon.
But check this out. When biblical authors like Moses or Isaiah looked back at the origins of Babylon, they saw more than just a human rebellion, but also a spiritual rebellion.
What was this spiritual rebellion?
Well, there were members of the divine council who, like the humans, didn't want to represent God's authority anymore. They wanted to be God, and they rebelled. And so these created beings deceived humans into worshiping them instead of the Creator. And so Babylon becomes the biblical image for the combined human and spiritual rebellion.
And so God scatters the people from Babylon into different nations.
And in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says, this is when God also scattered the rebels of the divine council with them.
So the nations are handed over to spiritual rulers.
Yes, and this is why when the biblical prophets look out at the violent empires of their day, they see two dimensions to all the chaos and injustice. Human rebels who are being corrupted by the worship of spiritual rebels, the idol gods of money, sex, and military power.
Yeah, when humans give their allegiance to these powers, it leads to a world like ours.
Right, and the best example of this is the story of the Exodus, where we're told that the Egyptian genocide of the Israelites was inspired by Pharaoh and by the gods of Egypt.
That's really intense.
But it's not the end of the story. When God rescued the Israelites from Egypt and its gods, he invited them to become his covenant partners and learn a different way of ruling the world.
And they agree to it, but in the end they don't honor the partnership. They give their allegiance to other gods.
And so this leads to their exile in Babylon, where they become slaves once again to a foreign nation and their spiritual rulers, awaiting a new exodus into freedom. And this is where the story of Jesus picks up. He said he was here to rescue the world and take it back from the rebels.
Which rebels? The human ones or the spiritual ones?
Exactly. For Jesus, it was all connected. When he marched into Jerusalem for Passover, he was announcing the ultimate exodus. He was there to confront and overcome all rebel powers and authorities, and he did it by giving up his life.
So this is what the Apostle Paul meant when he said that Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities, triumphing over them by the cross.
Yes, Jesus condemned our evil by allowing the rebels to unleash all their hate and evil on him. But then he overcame it with the power of his love and resurrection life. And then Jesus told his followers that all authority in heaven and earth now belongs to him.
Yeah, the ultimate human and divine partner. This is really good news.
Yeah, and it's why the apostles started inviting everyone to give their allegiance to the risen Jesus, to discover freedom and a new way to be human.
Now, while Jesus gained a decisive victory over the rebel powers, he didn't destroy them. They're still around, causing problems.
Yes, and in fact, they are the problem. The apostles said that humanity's real enemy is never another human. Rather, it's the spiritual powers that animate our cultural idols that inspire hatred, division, and violence.
So when I see people hurting other people, behind it is the divine council gone rogue. How do you deal with this kind of enemy?
Well, the Apostle Paul said we can resist by putting on the character traits of Jesus like armor, faithfulness, justice, and peace. And he said that our only weapon is the Word of God. That is, the biblical story of good news that Jesus has overcome all rebels with the divine power of his life and love.
You just watched a video on the Divine Council.
Now, there are more spiritual beings in the heavenly realm along with the divine council. They're called angels and cherubim, and that's what we're going to look at next.
Now,
would the angels want to leave God's side?
well, that's part of what we're going to be talking about here.
Are they on earth right now? Doing that same stuff?
Well, you kind of get the impression that they're kind of behind the scenes, doing stuff behind the scenes now, even. That's the image you get in there. And why would they want to? Well, it was a desire for more power. It was a desire to not represent God, but to be God, to be the highest power. And really the chasing after power and the chasing there's a passage in one of John's letters called, it's the first letter that John wrote later in the New Testament, where he talks about how he talks about how we need to not give into, refers to the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, and it's the quest for things and the quest for power and the quest for status. And those things kind of permeate the whole idea of evil. That those things kind of push us always towards evil and away from God. And we try to fulfill those things on our own terms. So that's kind of what they're getting at here. It's like, what are the spirit beings behind what's going on?
Are they the devil?
That gets interesting. Because when we commonly translate, and you'll see it in one of the passages we're going to look at today, when we commonly translate it Satan, the Hebrew behind it has the definite article the in front of it. So it's the Satan. It's not, or technically it's the Satan. Satan would be the Hebrew word. And that is the Hebrew word that means accuser. So whether or not that's a personal being or a personal name always kind of depends on whether or not it has the article. And so sometimes some people, some of the divine council were referred to as the Satan, but that doesn't necessarily, it could be the same being, but it may be that there are other, but it's a move towards evil, or a move towards a different view of evil. I'm just going to go ahead and we're going to pull up the slides here, and I'll read the scriptures for today. All right, so here are the passages. We're going to look at a couple of different passages where the divine council is mentioned, and we're just going to see kind of after wherever. Well, like I said, we'll get into the whole rebellion side of it more when we get into talking about demons and Satan in particular. Although Satan, or the Satan, comes up as a character in one of these stories. So let's go ahead and we'll read here. This is from Job, the first chapter of Job. This is 6 through 12 specifically. One day, the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has a good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his prosperity, or his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but do not harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. So you get this image of this divine council. It's kind of like they're almost having a staff meeting. And one of the people there is this person that is called, I mean, at the beginning, they actually translate it properly there, but then they throw Satan or Satan in there because a lot of people are used to seeing that. But the Hebrew word is actually the accuser. So this member of the divine council who kind of takes an accusatory role or relationship with humanity is there. So whether or not that is the same, what becomes kind of in popular culture known as Satan or not, we don't know. But this accuser is part of the divine council, and there is there's kind of like this dialogue about what's going on Earth. And he's like, well, yeah, I'm checking out and hello? Hey. Okay, welcome.
How you doing?
Hey, Jimmy, long time.
I know.
See.
I'm not doing too good though, but
You know?
no, my leg's giving out. I gotta go back to the hospital, August the 12th and August the 20th.
Well, okay, so we're talking about the introduction to Job here.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
No problem. we'll chat some more later.
Um,
But anyway, so the Satan is like, oh, so he's like talking about, yeah, I'm all about my business. And you kind of see this thing here that it's kind of like a dialogue. You kind of see this dialogue about they're working with God. And I almost kind of when I look at when I see this image of the council here, it's almost like it's a weekly staff meeting or something. Like they come together on a regular basis and consult about what's happening in the earth and some of the plans that God would make. And that's what they talk about here. Where in the video they mention how like you see the council kind of questioning God's favor that He shows upon a righteous person, and whether or not people truly would could not do anything without God's permission. God was the one who ultimately had the authority. Maybe sometimes we should think that sometimes it's more that God allowed more than God did it Himself. Sometimes God allows things to happen that are not necessarily what He would want to do Himself. But He trusted Job enough that he would withstand. He knew that Job would withstand this trial, or he was pretty confident of it. But in the process, though, God still sets limits. At first, He says, "Well, you can't touch him physically," and then the Satan comes back. Well, yeah, he's still got his health. Okay, everything, but you can't kill him. And so then that's when Job deals with boils and things like that. But the important thing, again, to remember is that God sets the limits in it. He may allow these spiritual beings to do things, or members of this divine council to do things, but He sets a limit on how far it can go. And again, it's interesting because, we can look at them and go, again, why take a chance like this? But God trusted that Job would withstand the trial. And I was recently, actually yesterday, I was listening to a few different podcasts. I was listening to one interviewing the author of a book called The God Who Trusts, and how the relational nature that we have with God. That God trusts us at times, puts His trust in us. And yeah, He could get frustrated and it could get messed up. But a lot of times He trusts us with things that even when other members of the divine council are at work, He trusts that we will honor Him in the end. So that's what we have to remember, that, again, the ultimate thing is that these people, this divine council cannot do anything without God's permission, without God. We're going to look at one other story here in Isaiah. And here, as a prophet, Isaiah gets a peek into the divine council. And it says, "It was the year King Uzziah died that I saw the Lord. He was sitting on a lofty throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Attending him were mighty seraphim, each having 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. They were calling out to each other, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of heaven's armies. The whole earth is filled with his glory.'" That was another reference to the council or the divine council or these spiritual beings. Sometimes they were referred to as heaven's armies. And Yahweh was the Lord over all of them. Their voices shook the temple to its foundation, and the entire building was filled with smoke. Then I said, "It's all over. I'm doomed, for I am a sinful man. I have filthy lips, and I live among a people with filthy lips. Yet I have seen the King, the Lord of heaven's armies." Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. He touched my lips with it and said, "See, this coal has touched your lips. Now your guilt is removed and your sins are forgiven." Then I heard the Lord ask, "Whom should I send as a messenger to this people? Who will go for us?" I said, "Here am I, send me." So you have this other council gathering, and it's interesting, Isaiah recognizes his unworthiness to be there. He's like, I live with sinful people, and I'm one of them, type of a thing. So he recognizes his unworthiness. But then a member of the council, probably why God had him here was for this ending portion here, where he's like, the council is trying to figure out who they're going to send to be a messenger to Israel at a time when they aren't going to listen. And Isaiah is there at the moment, and the member of the council is basically preparing or helping prepare Isaiah for his eventual call, because he says, "Yeah, you may be unworthy, but here, this coal touching your lips, it's a symbolic thing. This is purifying you from the sin that your people, and you are forgiven of those sins." And what the council was doing was preparing Isaiah for his call. And you kind of notice what God says. He's like, "Who will I send as a messenger? Who will speak for us?" So it's kind of like he brings the plural into it in the whole council. It's like he's consulting them to say, okay, who's going to be the one? Yet they probably already knew the answer, because there's Isaiah. Well, who else could it be but the human that's there? So, but here's the key things we have to know. I think, like it says in the video, why this council? Why these spiritual beings? Because God seems to like to share his authority and the task of running the universe. He could do it on his own, but it's it really in some ways shows the importance of relationship. Because even throughout the beginning of time, God had a community he was a part of. And I think the things we work on and the things we do, we need to be always looking to God's example, that he had a community to work with, and we need to have a community to work with too.
Leon, another thing, the way it sounds there is that he just wants to make his point all the way across.
Yeah.
And then make his point to whatever he speaks.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't understand where that first video came into, where they said that evil was as spirits left God before it was evil. And Dan went to everybody, started making them bad people. If God saw that and is doing it the same way today, why doesn't he stop?
Because he trusts.
For
Like
how long will you trust?
He's going to give it as much time as he feels he needs to. And that's the thing, we have to have the patience to trust. It's a two-way street of trust. That God trusts humanity to do what's right. And he believes, he wants to believe in humanity and believe the best. There's a passage that says in Peter, in one of Peter's letters, this gets into the whole issue of the second coming and stuff like that. And this was like 2,000 years ago when Christians were being burned at the stake, they were being stoned.
Witches,
No, I'm talking about Christians in the Roman Empire.
Christians, yeah, fine.
Oh yeah, because Christians were not the favored religion back then.
Mm-hmm.
There was a battle that was going. The Roman Empire really was one of these empires of a worship of power and all these other things, and the same idolatry that you see happen. They talk about in the video different kings, and all those spiritual powers were at work in the Roman Empire. And the battle between the Christians and the Roman Empire, the biggest part was the Caesars exalted themselves to the level of God. And they basically said Caesar is God. Yeah. And that contradicted, for the Christians, a devotion to Jesus as being, the true representative of God on earth and being God. So a lot of times what they were persecuted for was the fact that they would not worship Caesar as God, because they knew a different God. And so even then, Peter says in a letter, he says, God's not slow in keeping his promises, as you might think he's being slow. As he's talking to this church that's being persecuted. And he says, he is patient because he wants to give everyone an opportunity to come to repentance, to come to a place of being in right relationship with God. Now, there's a point where it gets so bad that God does intervene in times. He intervened in Roman history by the Romans eventually being defeated.
But why does that takes a long time to actually put people's spirits?
Because it's just, maybe he sees a purpose in a longer period of waiting. I think for myself, for years, I prayed for my mother's healing. And I've seen some things happen. But she still very much lives in her delusional world and in her world of mental illness. And, yet I trust that whether or not it happens this side of heaven, that she will be complete again in eternity, if not before then. So yeah, I would love to see the answer come sooner. I would have loved to have seen it happen 40 years ago now, but it hasn't. And so I go, well, I still trust God, and God still trusts us to be faithful to him through all the trials. Much like he trusted Job through all of his trials, too. So I think the other thing, and Yahweh, or the big G God, what we refer to as the big G God, he is ultimately over all of these. I mean, he has authority over all these divine councils. So, and all these spiritual beings. So, a lot of times we tend to shy away from stuff like this because it's not so rational. It's not something we can easily figure out with our head. In fact, Tim Mackey says that in the podcast, one of the guys on the Bible Project, he talks about how probably before they make this video, kind of while they were making the original God video, he talks about how that was the type of stuff he used to avoid because it was just too crazy for him. And then he was like, God spoke to him and said, back in 2018, he said, you can't keep avoiding this stuff. You got to look into it. You got to start taking it seriously. And so now, so a lot of this has come out of his own struggle to understand these things. But I think what comes out of it really is that, we look at our culture presents all these different images of spiritual beings. We try to act like we're a very rationalistic culture. We've got it all figured out, or we can handle anything through science and our own abilities. But yet I think sometimes we recognize that there are forces we just don't know what to deal with. And that's
like the school thing.
Yeah, some of that could happen again. We don't know what's going to happen with that. Yeah. But I think, we just have to realize there are forces that we don't know how to deal with. And
like the virus, the United States don't know how to deal with it.
yeah, I'd say at least on a political level, we don't know how to deal with it.
It all comes from that China people, thank God.
Well, I don't know that it came from them. I don't know that.
Said that
No, there's a lot of different authorities. There was a lab where it first appeared, was in a lab that was studying this new virus in China, but how exactly that got to here, we don't know.
Yeah.
And there were people here who may have had it before it even started to show up in China, because there are some evidence of some earlier experiences with that same virus. So,
I have a silly question, might be, but you ever think maybe they had truckloads of that being shipped or something and they didn't know, and it might have gotten overturned or something? It might have been sprayed like that.
well, I don't know if it was that. I don't know if it was that.
Things that happen though, but
That can happen. That somehow, whatever they were studying in this lab escaped. That's all we know. That's all we know. But I think beyond the virus, I think we have spiritual beings that we deal with as well. And that's where you see it, the place where a lot of this stuff gets really worked out in our society is in animation and superhero comics and things like that. Because we work a lot of these themes into, a lot of the Marvel stuff and a lot of the DC comic stuff. These themes get worked in, but it's humans trying to grapple with the divine council not always having a supreme authority that's over them.
I think that's they don't have this virus.
they're talking about November, I believe, what I hear.
No, I don't know. It could be longer than that. So,
It could
but
be longer. No.
yeah, it could be longer. We don't know how long it'll be. So,
They don't know.
we just gotta be careful. You gotta be careful.
But I know one person that knows.
Ooh.
God.
He has a bit of a handle on it, and if we listen to him, maybe we would learn to live by his values instead of our own.
Yeah.
I do think that God is allowing this to happen, partly to teach us a lesson, and hopefully as a culture we learn that. that, and just the realization that we our selfish pursuits sometimes make it so we're, as a culture, it's too difficult for us to be able to do the things we need to do to be healthy. Learning how to be more healthy is an important part of it. Learning to slow down and not be so at a hyper speed that like being forced to slow down for a virus seems like prison.
Yeah, that's the way they're telling everybody. I mean, you must stay at home, and then all them stay-at-home orders, that's like prison right there.
Well, it can feel that way,
Actually, it's not
but
like prison. Actually,
I know it's
outside your
safe,
door, and then you can go in your house and watch TV and stuff like that.
it's a little. I mean, those that have been in prison can tell you it's not as bad.
Or is this prison with luxuries?
Yeah, maybe,
Get it?
maybe. But I think we don't like being told what to do.
That's right.
And we got to learn sometimes that we have to lay aside our individual comforts for the sake.
I can imagine God pointing his finger down and telling everybody to be careful, behave, do what we say.
Well, I think he's he's not just pointing his finger down and shaking at us. He's probably a little bit more compassionate than that. But he is probably allowing this thing. I want to see if humanity can pull through this.
Yeah.
And hopefully we learn to be better on the other side of it. Hopefully we learn to be more kingdom-like on the other side. More kingdom of God-like on the other side of it. So, any other thoughts, questions, or anything comes up? Yeah, I know you didn't get to see the whole video. I'll show it to you.
Oh. Oh, you mean there was more to it, Leon?
No. It's just Tina didn't get to see the video. That's what I was saying.
Oh.
There'll be other ones. Next week we will talk about angels and cherubim, which are the ones that didn't do that.
Yeah.
So,
Did he replace the ones that we built?
I don't know. Maybe not.
I think he would replace them because it makes them harder.
Well, not necessarily. He might have replaced them. Who knows?
Hey, Leon,
Here's the thing. Over time, we really don't get a lot of detail on it.
Yeah.
There's kind of this parallel. Just talking about a little bit touching into the rebellion. There's this parallel story going on of a heavenly rebellion and an earthly rebellion of humanity saying, we want to do things our way. And these certain members of the divine council saying, well, we think we can do a better job of running the universe than you can. So we're going to do it ourselves. And the passage about dispersing the divine council among the nations is rather, or at least the rebellious divine council among the nations is rather interesting in Deuteronomy. But we'll look at that one. We may not look at all this stuff in detail in these discussions, but I do have some documents that I can print up that have some more detailed stuff for the people that want to go into that stuff a little bit more.
Yeah, the fire service gets into the water system.
Oh, that's another thing. Yeah, I wasn't thinking about that, Greg.
Well, I don't know. We'll have to hope that it doesn't. I don't know if they've said if it could or it couldn't. I don't think it can get into it. It's an airborne virus.
Yeah, but there's another thing, Leon.